with an idea this morning. And that idea, in sum, is this phrase we all throw around at times that simply can be summed up as oh, sorry, I'm not myself. And, it's something we say when we're overwhelmed, when we're grieving, when we're suffering in some way, when we're not able to perform a certain mask or acceptable identity. And I say this because even up until fairly recently, I was talking about a really low part of my own life in the terms of, what happens when you're just not yourself for an extended period of time and you don't know who you are anymore? And when I said that, it rung true. But what I'm actually sitting with today, especially with everything we're seeing on a global stage, with the amount of grief and fear and outrage and anxiety and uncertainty that so many of us are coping with, I was thinking about what I had said in that context and how many people feel these things, experience these things, and might use the term, I'm not myself, to distance themselves from those human experiences. And then I asked myself, well, why? Why do we need to create this distance or this separation from the parts of ourselves that are grieving, the parts of ourselves that aren't perfect or able to perform a certain way? And I think it really does come back to the fact that for many of us, we still see these human emotions, these real ways of sitting with and processing emotions as imperfect or as something that should be hidden. And I think it would be wrong to not tie that feeling of imperfection, of unworthiness, into the reality that the systems most of us were born into, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, they don't allow us to be fully human. They force us, they ask us to perform, to be useful, to show up in a certain way all the time, or our worth is on the line. We're not worthy if we're not able to show up in that way. And so we have all these stories celebrating people who have gone through all that shit. Pardon my language, but it is shit. And still show up at work. There's a sense of superiority that comes from being able to compartmentalize our human experience, our lived experience, and still perform or succeed or achieve, or basically continue to put out value, continue to put out work. It's only been relatively recently in my living memory of seeing creators actually take time to pause and process grief. Because, at least processing this grief or anger on camera is still an output. And I do think there is a lot of value in showing up if you're called to process on camera, because it helps others recognize a pathway towards processing. It is a collective space, and I do think there's value in that. So I'm not saying creators that do that are wrong. But at the same time, I think it is important to be aware of the ways that we might expect people to still show up and perform and put out content and go to work like nothing's happened. Or maybe they're crying at their desk, but they're still at work and they're still doing work. Because that's something we celebrate. And in an age day in and day out, I want to kind of bring that awareness back to highlight, and ironically, I'm coming up to a stop sign right now as I'm saying this, as I'm coming to this point, to really highlight that it is okay and acceptable and safe to pause, to stop, to honor those emotional realities and wounds in private. You do not have to put your humanity on show. And I'm not saying deny realities. I'm not saying processing grief and then show up online again like nothing happened. I don't think that's true either. But the deep emotional processing work, if you're not someone who's called to facilitate that work for others, I think we need to allow space and honor the space that people need to take to process it in their own way, in a way that actually helps them show up as an active part of the global community we're all a part of. Because our privacy is something that is worth protecting. And this is something that I have been sitting with on a personal level since the murder of Renee Good. Because there was a period of time where, I wasn't sure what exactly I could post. I'm in Canada. I'm not actively, the same patterns are playing out in my home province, so I'm not going to diminish the lead up to that the way that it is hitting close to home for me. But I'm also not in the States right now. I'm not living in those current events, in those protests. And so I really wasn't sure what my role was in helping facilitate that grief, in helping understand it, in helping activate people. Yes, I have resources that could very well be incredibly helpful to Americans or even to Albertans or Canadians who are feeling these patterns and want to get ahead of it. That's one of the reasons why I've been pushing my Transforming Communities guidebook lately is because it helps people get ahead of that. It helps them consider what they actually want to build as opposed to just watching these patterns take place and standing on the sidelines. I'll throw the link in that down below. I'm going to include a coupon code for that because it is such an important resource to have accessible right now. But at the same time, it did not sit right with me to jump on that horrible tragedy, that unavoidable tragedy, and promote my work. And so I was in this pause period, and a lot of this pause, I found myself really stuck in my mind because it was a tragedy. It did activate me. I was and still am grieving that loss of life and the others who have been attacked, killed, harmed, made afraid by ICE since this has been put into motion, since this has been mobilizing. But I wasn't letting myself process the grief. And it was with Renee Good's murder that I began to be aware of how heavy and massive this grief was in my own body. And I did ask myself, I was like, it would be valuable, and it is something I could do, and it is something I want to do at some point. But is it the right time to post a guided meditation on how to process grief? Is it the right time? And for me, it wasn't. To do that publicly, it wasn't the right time, because I needed to walk that path in a very personal and intimate way first. And after several sleepless nights of not knowing how to move forward, or how to find clarity, or how to process this grief, I was finally able to do that. Just in my bed by myself one night, I was able to walk myself through that process. And it was an embodied process. It was a process that really required me to step away from my mind. And I really think that these kinds of embodied processes are so critical in times like this, because it was through that embodiment that I was actually able to find clarity for how I can be of service right now, how I can be an active and engaged part of the solution, the rebirth, the strategies we need to take and undergo, the paths we need to walk in order to stand up against the tyranny that's being sowed in our society, and to start actually birthing and creating a new future. And I'm not saying that this path is done. I'm not saying I'm at the end of it. I am saying I'm hopeful and that I'm activated and I'm willing to be engaged, to learn, to listen, to collaborate with like-minded people. I am saying that. But I was only truly able to get to that point by honoring my grief in my own time, in privacy, in deep and true and authentic connection to myself. And if you're someone who's stumbling across this video and you're resonating with what I'm saying, I just wanted to affirm to you that I see you. And grieving on our own in the ways that we need to grieve in private, when it allows us to actually move forward and be a part of the solution and the movement and the building, is just as important as creating a pathway for grieving and embodiment in front of people publicly through our platforms. They are one and the same in so many ways. And we need to do both, and we need to be authentic to ourselves in the capacity that we have. And so wherever you are in your journey, again, whether you work best processing your grief on your own, whether you join a facilitated circle, or whether you lead grieving, or you grieve very actively through something like protests and mobilization, there's no wrong way. The only wrong way is to not do it, to not actually take the time to feel into this lived reality, to deny it, to minimize it, to simply push it to the side and say, oh, I'm just not myself right now, rather than claiming this reality that we're in, claiming our grief, claiming our outrage, claiming our fear. Because this is what was coming to me today, is that our fullness and wholeness of who we are requires that we are able to embody the grief and the anger too. We are able to understand that that is a part of ourselves too. Because so many of us, for whatever reason, have been taught to detach from the unpresentable parts of ourselves. the parts that are indecent or outrageous or make us less of an authority in our lived experience. So many people, especially people who have been marginalized in some way, whether that's a woman being told she's too emotional, or, especially racialized groups being told they're too angry, or it makes me laugh because it's so obviously a way to disempower us from our wholeness, from our full activation. If we're being too sensitive or too emotional, it's because those emotions make people uncomfortable. And it's because it's through claiming our emotions that we're able to be truly empowered. Because when we don't actually move through that processing in whatever way is true and right for us, whether it's in community, whether it's on our own, whether it's by leading or whether it's by following, if we don't actually do the work to claim the wholeness and lived reality of our emotions, and I'm getting emotional right now, if we don't do that work, that is when we become disempowered. That is when we become frozen and incapable of moving towards empowered action and transformation and sovereignty and agency. Because when we're numb to our realities, when we're numb to our grief, when we're numb to our anger and outrage, that's when we start to let things happen that shouldn't happen to anyone. That is when we start to stand on the sidelines and watch what's going on and convince ourselves from our mind, because often when we live in our minds, it's because we're disembodied, we're disconnected from the feelings of our grief, the feelings of our outrage. We don't feel the way that anger activates us because we're living in our mind. And our minds, as powerful as they can also be excellent liars. That's when we convince ourselves that, it won't happen to us. And so, as a Canadian right now, as a white woman in Canada right now, I do understand how it can be easy to convince ourselves that it's not going to happen here. I understand how it's easy to convince ourselves it's not going to happen to me. My proximity to whiteness and my privilege means that if I play the part right, if I dissociate myself enough from the realities of my body, from the grief I'm feeling, from the anger, from the fear, if I numb myself to that, and if I tell myself the right lies, and if I play the part that my soul does not want me to play, I could be safe. I could be fine. But we saw what happened with Renee Good. We saw what happens when we don't deny the reality of the injustices right now. And when we take accountability for our emotions, when we take accountability for the ways that we're being called to mobilize and be active, now more than ever, in my living memory at least, we're also going to be held accountable in very real ways in the world around us. And this isn't to say that we shouldn't take those steps, because we absolutely should. But the bravery that's required to do that comes from being radically honest with what's going on right now and with what our reality is in our body right now. And it comes with being unpresentable or indecent. It comes from letting ourselves be seen as grieving or imperfect, and understanding that our worth does not depend on our output. It does not depend on how respectable we look when we go to work on Monday after sobbing all weekend because that's how we need to process. It does not depend on us being polite in our content or catering to the right crowd. It depends on being authentic and raw and true, and understanding that that truth and that authenticity and that wholeness of who we are is what makes us worthy. And so when I reflect back on when I used to say things like, oh, I wasn't myself, that's because there was a part of me that was scared of claiming the ways I quote unquote let myself go. There was a part of myself that was scared of claiming the ways I was abandoning my truth. And the fact is that means I needed to claim my capacity to abandon people in need, because at that time of my life of myself, I was the person who needed me the most. And I abandoned myself for years. But I've also done the work now to come back to myself and to be present with myself through my own wounding, through my own limiting beliefs, through my growth and discomfort. And it's because I did that work that I can show up here today and talk to you in this video. It's because I've done that work that I am able to enter community spaces and move towards empowered sovereignty and agency and a willingness to shape the futures ahead of us through the discomfort and grief and outrage that is a part of that. It's because I've already done the work within, and now I'm able to take that work beyond myself. And I'm not I'm not perfect. Again, pardon the language, but it already happened. So I am not claiming to be perfect on this path. I am not claiming that there are going to be 0 instances where I get too overwhelmed with the realities of the world, where I do just need to shut down and learn to regulate myself in private. For me, that connection to self, that independent ability to do that on my own in solitude, is a very important part of how I process things. So even when, maybe one day I'll show up and do a grief circle, grief meditation online, moving through my own grief as I'm helping you move through yours. Maybe that will happen one day, but a lot of my current reality really requires that I honor that on my own. But that's okay, because I'm still honoring it, and I'm still showing up with a willingness to learn, to be present in the discomfort, and to stay grounded in my body and my lived reality and my compassion and empathy for others, even when it's getting incredibly hard and painful to sit with, because the realities of our world are showing us so much grief and anger and fear and uncertainty right now. But to stay present in the world, and I don't mean just to stay online or stay informed and overwhelm our nervous system by reading all the terrible stories out there, but to stay present and to stay aware in a way that moves me towards action and mobilization and authentic presence in my business is something that I am committing to. That is a seed I am planting for 2026. And if you're still here, if you're watching this video, and maybe this is your first time coming across the Vibrant Systems channel, maybe you've followed me for a while, but if this is work that you're resonating with and you want to do it, whether whether that's on a personal level or in your community, now is when I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel for more content like this, for tools to help you in this work. And I want to invite you to check out vibrantsystems.ca, where I host my shop for personal development materials. Things like Elements of Self, which is the process I walked to actually restore that connection and wholeness of myself, to claim myself in full, including the wounded, which is how I was able to heal. I want to invite you to check out my values identification and exploration workbook, because that's the pathway I walked towards figuring out what I actually care about, what I want to stand for, what I'm willing to make sacrifices for, who I want to be when I do eventually die, even if that is before the end of this year. And also, I want to invite you to check out my Transforming Communities guidebook, because that is the path of walking towards embodied, real, mobilized action on a community level. And if you don't want to do those, if you want to work with me directly, vibrantsystems.ca is also how you can connect with me for deeper work, for more involved work. My name's Danielle, and honestly, my mission is to help people deepen their connection to self, to others, and to the environment, because these connections need us. They need our full awareness and willingness to commit to them now, because we are at a transformational and revolutionary part of the global system. And I believe that means we have immense power to make something amazing. Truly, I do think that this is an opportunity to change the course of the futures of not only our own lives, but the lives of our children and our grandchildren.